Welcome to this lecture on the diffusional school of anthropology. In this session, we will explore how early 20th century thinkers challenged classical evolutionary theories by emphasizing the spread of cultural traits across the globe rather than independent invention. Let's dive into the origins, key figures, and major branches of this influential school of thought. To understand the diffusional school, we first need to look at what they were reacting against: 19th century classical evolutionism. Evolutionists were well aware that cultures had similarities and differences. They generally believed differences existed because societies progressed at unequal paces. When it came to similarities between distant cultures with no historical contact, they relied on the concept of psychic unity. This idea suggested that the human mind is uniform, so mankind reacts roughly the same way to uniform environments. Therefore, similar traits evolved separately as parallel independent inventions. While evolutionists recognized that diffusion, the borrowing of traits, was an undeniable fact, they felt it interfered with their neat, linear evolutionary schemes, and maintained that traits were invented more often than they were imitated. During the 20th century, several schools of thought emerged in Britain, America, and Germany that challenged these evolutionary ideas. While they claimed to be anti-evolutionist, their primary target was actually the concept of psychic unity. The diffusionists emphasized a radically different premise, that human beings are fundamentally uninventive. They argued that important, complex inventions were made only once at a particular place and time. From that single point of origin, these cultural traits spread throughout the rest of the world. This spread happened through two primary processes: diffusion and migration.
Let's clarify the difference between diffusion and migration, as they represent two distinct processes of cultural change. Cultural diffusion, broadly speaking, is the process by which culture traits discovered or invented in one society are spread to others. Specifically, diffusion refers to one culture taking over traits from another through imitation or borrowing. Migration, on the other hand, implies the physical movement of people. In migration, culture carriers break away from their original settlements and move to new regions, taking their cultural inventory with them and adapting it to new environmental conditions.
Historically, certain societies acted as massive centers of cultural diffusion. These were typically progressive societies that developed rapidly through invention and discovery. For example, for many centuries, Egypt was a cultural center from which arts and political organizations spread northwest into Europe and east as far as India. Rome served as a great center for the diffusion of law throughout Europe. In Asia, the Chinese Middle Kingdom spread its culture across the mainland, while India was a center from which Buddhism diffused to other Asian nations, and its decimal system eventually reached Arabia and Europe. Later, around the 4th century BC, Western Europe emerged as a dominant cultural center, much like developed nations export their culture today. It is important to note that centers of cultural diffusion were not always the original places of cultural development. In some cases, a society acted more as a trader or conduit of culture rather than the originator. For instance, the early Greeks were heavily involved in cultural migration, acting as traders of culture across the Mediterranean. Similarly, in ancient times, when India's territory extended up to the Afghan border, Kabul served as a crucial center of trade. Merchants from various countries would meet there, exchanging not only physical goods but also cultural ideas, facilitating diffusion without necessarily inventing the traits themselves. The process of diffusion doesn't just happen automatically. It is influenced by several key factors. First is the level of relation and communication between different societies. Without contact, traits cannot spread. Second is the receiving culture's need and desire for new traits. Third is the competition new traits face from existing, older traits, and the opposition they might encounter from traditionalists. Finally, the respect and recognition afforded to the people bringing the new traits plays a massive role. If the carriers are highly regarded, their culture is more likely to be adopted. Diffusionists also outlined specific conditions and characteristics governing how diffusion occurs. First, a cultural group will only adopt a trait if it is economically or socially useful and meaningful to them. Second, during diffusion, a trait rarely remains in its exact original form. It changes to adapt to new environmental situations. Third, the process generally flows from a highly developed culture to a less developed one. Fourth, borrowing traits can create significant cultural change. While some traits assimilate easily, others disrupt and transform the adopting society. Lastly, physical and technological obstacles like oceans, mountains, deserts, or a lack of transport and communication facilities can severely hinder the diffusion process. Diffusionists did not all agree on where culture traits originated or how they spread. Based on these differences of opinion, and largely divided by nationality,
Three main schools of diffusion emerged. As you can see in this chart, we have the British School of Diffusion, led by figures like G.E. Smith, W.J. Perry, and W.H.R. Rivers. Then we have the German School, featuring F. Ratzel, F. Graebner, and F.W. Schmidt. Finally, the American School of Diffusion, championed by Franz Boas, Clark Whistler, and A.L. Kroeber. Let's examine the British School first. The British School of Diffusion is often referred to as the Pan-Egyptian School. Interestingly, it came into being quite late in the history of anthropological thought, and it was also the first to disappear. The school was founded by Grafton Elliott Smith, with W.J. Perry as his most devoted follower. They are widely designated as extreme diffusionists or Egyptologists because of their incredibly narrow view. They believed that Egypt was the single, exclusive cradle of all human civilization. They completely ignored the theories of their German counterparts, focusing entirely on diffusion and migration radiating outward from Egypt alone. Let's look closer at the founder, Grafton Elliott Smith. By profession, Smith was actually an anatomist. During his career, he visited Egypt and became a profound admirer of its ancient civilization. Upon returning to Cambridge, he was struck by the similarities between the large stone monuments of Egypt, which were associated with sun worship, and the English megaliths, such as Stonehenge. Smith believed that the primitive Druids of England were simply incapable of inventing such complex structures on their own. He concluded that these English monuments had to be borrowed from Egypt, serving as crude imitations of Egyptian pyramids and mastabas. Smith didn't stop in England. He investigated further and found pyramidal structures all over the world: Maya pyramids, Japanese pagodas, temples in Cambodia and Bali, and American Indian burial mounds. He argued that they all displayed the same basic form and were therefore related to Egyptian prototypes. He concluded that cultural traits began spreading from Egypt around 400 BC. In his 1928 book, The Origin of Civilization, he emphasized that Egypt was the birthplace of agriculture, made possible by controlling the river's inundations. This agricultural success stimulated the invention of pottery, weaving, the wheel, writing, and the establishment of cities, government, and the worship of the sun god. According to Smith, the Egyptians discovered navigation and traveled far and wide in search of precious stones and metals, bringing the benefits of their civilization to the rest of the world. He viewed the recipients of this culture as mere weak imitators. Smith coined the term natural man to describe anyone outside the influence of Egyptian civilization. He described their culture purely in negative terms. They had no clothing, no housing, no government, and no burial practices. He argued that a revolution in human life only occurred when this uninventive natural man borrowed civilizational traits from Egypt. With one mighty stroke, Smith attempted to abolish all ideas of independent invention and psychic unity. Elliott Smith's most devout supporter was William James Perry. While Perry didn't make specific theoretical contributions of his own, he blindly and enthusiastically supported Smith's theory. After visiting sun temples in Cairo, Perry published a highly popular book in 1923 titled The Children of the Sun. He argued that the concept of the sun god as a universal deity who incarnated as earthly rulers originated solely in Egypt and diffused worldwide. According to Perry, everything from pyramid structures and temple building to the use of gold and silver were creations of Egypt's civilization. Like Smith, he vehemently opposed the ideas of psychic unity and independent invention. The third major figure in the British school was W.H.R. Rivers. Originally a medical doctor, Rivers was part of the famous 1898 Torres Strait expedition, the first interdisciplinary anthropological expedition. He studied the sensory capacities of natives and concluded there were no racial differences in pure sense acuity. In 1900, he published his famous genealogical method, a highly scientific approach to collecting kinship and social data. In 1906, he published a classic monograph on the Tota tribe of India. Interestingly, up to this point, Rivers showed no influence of diffusionism in his writings, despite the Tota culture showing clear signs of Hindu cultural diffusion. Rivers suddenly shifted his stance, declaring himself a diffusionist around 1911. In 1912, he published a fascinating degeneration-oriented article titled Disappearance of Useful Arts. In it, he argued against the evolutionary idea of constant progress, stating that culture traits frequently degenerate and disappear. He used the example of Melanesian islanders who lived on small islands but had no canoes. They must have known how to build them to reach the islands initially, but the craft had died out. This supported the diffusionist view that humans are basically uninventive and rely heavily on inherited or borrowed traits, which can be lost over time.
Rivers further applied his diffusionist ideas to explain anomalies, such as the presence of 5 entirely different burial rituals within a small, homogeneous population of Australian Aboriginals. He argued that these simple, uninventive people could not have developed such variations by themselves. Instead, he proposed that small, successive migrations of men had arrived in canoes. These men married local women, and while their offspring lost the original language and physical traits of their forefathers, they retained a strong emotional attachment to their specific burial rites. Thus, Rivers used migration and imitation to explain cultural similarities and differences, aligning himself firmly with Smith and Perry. Despite his brilliance, Rivers' work had notable shortcomings. Critics, like Robert Lowy, pointed out that Rivers never conducted intensive studies of language, art, religion, or the broader history of culture. He saw himself as a direct competitor to giants like E.B. Tyler and Franz Boas, which may have clouded his objectivity. Furthermore, he was often so overwhelmed by his own findings that he treated them as groundbreaking inventions and was criticized for being poorly read in the existing literature, acting like a modern mariner shouting with glee over discovering America, unaware it was already known. Looking at the British school as a whole, it suffered from severe weaknesses. Their extreme diffusionism rested on the flawed conviction that inventiveness was incredibly rare, and that inventions only happened once, in Egypt. They used the hypothetical uninventiveness of man to explain away everything, completely ignoring the specific functions and meanings of cultural traits in different societies. Their intense bias towards Egypt meant they ignored other ancient contemporary civilizations like India. Furthermore, they only looked at the simple diffusion of material objects, completely ignoring non-material culture and complex cultural systems. Because of this narrow, extreme scope, the British school was the last to arrive and the first to disappear from the anthropological scene. Moving on to the German school of diffusion, also known as the Kulturkreis or Culture Circle school, this school is generally considered far superior to its British counterpart in terms of methodology and outlook. Unlike Smith and Perry, the German diffusionists were not extreme. They completely rejected the idea that Egypt was the sole center of culture. In fact, they accepted both evolution and diffusion as mechanisms for cultural development. Their core concept was that cultural traits and complexes originated independently at several different places on Earth at different times. From these multiple centers, traits then migrated and were imitated globally. The German school proposed that if you scientifically examined layers of cultural traits, you could identify their migrations from different places. They believed that different circles or districts of culture developed in different phases. Every culture trait or complex belonged to a specific culture crisis, a culture circle, from which it migrated to other regions. Because they relied on historical facts and data to trace the spread of these traits from one circle to another, this group is also widely known as the Culture Historic School. The founder of this German school was Friedrich Ratzel. Originally a zoologist, he shifted to geography and eventually anthropology. In his 1882 book, Anthropogeography, he made a clear distinction between territorial and social geography, focusing heavily on how people relate to neighboring countries and how cultural traits are distributed. While Ratzel acknowledged that the environment played a role in adaptation, he was convinced that people were far more influenced by contact with one another than by factors like climate or terrain. He expanded on these ideas in his massive work, History of Mankind. Ratzel's views on psychic unity were somewhat ambiguous, but he firmly denied the classical evolutionary idea of multiple independent inventions. Like other diffusionists, he believed humans are much more prone to imitation than creativity. According to Ratzel, the most important task was discovering where cultural traits came from and where they went. He argued that it wasn't just single items that diffused, but whole cultural complexes that were transplanted through human migration. He also noted that when these complexes moved, adaptation to new environments would naturally cause variations in their outward shapes. This brings up a crucial question. How do you prove a historical relationship between similar objects found in different places? Ratzel warned that not every similarity implies contact. For an object to prove a historical link, it must possess features that are completely unrelated to its basic utility. For example, a canoe paddle must have a blade to function. That's utility. But if paddles in two distant cultures have the exact same incised ornamentations, that cannot be accidental. It implies borrowing. Ratzel called this the criterion of form, or Formengedanke. He famously applied this principle to the cross-sections of African bow shafts and the feathering of Indonesian arrows to prove a historical connection between them. Ratzel's student, Leo Frobenius, took these ideas further. He observed that historical connections usually meant the transmission of whole culture complexes, not just single traits. To prove this, he introduced geographical statistics, which involved counting the sheer number of similarities between areas, like finding similar bows, shields, masks, and drums in both West Africa and Indonesia. He also developed a biological or developmental criterion, arguing that when people migrate, their cultures adjust to the new ecology, meaning some traits change or disappear. Frobenius didn't just study material culture, he analyzed mythology, finding striking similarities between African and Indonesian stories, concluding that the higher culture of Indonesia must have been the originator. The main leader who truly formalized the culture crisis school was Fritz Graebner, a museum curator in Germany. Graebner took the ideas of Ratzel and Frobenius and applied them on a global scale. In his famous 1911 book, Method of Ethnology, he meticulously spelled out the methodological principles for the culture circle movement. Working closely with his colleague, Father Wilhelm Schmidt, Graebner established strict rules for identifying historical relationships and chronologies between different cultures. Graebner and Schmidt relied on two basic fundamental rules to reconstruct culture circles. The first was the criterion of form, which Schmidt called the criterion of quality. Building on Ratzel's idea, it states that if two culture elements share similarities that aren't dictated by their material or practical purpose, those similarities must be the result of diffusion, no matter how far apart the cultures are. The second rule is the criterion of quantity. This simply states that the probability of a historical relationship increases as you find more and more similar items between two cultures. One similarity might be a coincidence, but a dozen similarities prove a connection. Graebner theorized that early humans lived in small, isolated bands, and each developed its own distinctive primeval culture, which he called Urkulturen. Over time, these groups spread out and populated the continents. For Graebner, the ultimate goal of ethnology was to trace these relationships and reconstruct these original culture circles. Based on extensive research in Oceania, Graebner actually reconstructed 6 successive layers of cultural development. These ranged from the earliest Tasmanian culture, through Australian boomerang and totemic hunter cultures, up to the more recent Polynesian patrilineal culture. He categorized diffusion into primary and secondary types to explain how these layers blended and spread. Father Wilhelm Schmidt took Graebner's work and elevated it to a truly global level. Declaring himself a follower of Graebner, Schmidt rigorously applied the criteria of form and quantity to divide the entire culture of the world into different strata and circles. He claimed that by analyzing contemporary culture traits, he could reconstruct a limited number of original culture circles, and thereby understand the entire history of the world as the diffusion of these circles. Schmidt organized human cultural history into 4 major grades: the primitive, primary, secondary, and tertiary culture circles. Within these major grades, Schmidt identified specific subcircles. The primitive grade included 3 subcircles: the central exogamous circle, corresponding to pygmy peoples, the Arctic circle, corresponding to groups like the Eskimo, and the Antarctic circle, including Southeast Australians and Bushmen. Moving up to the primary stage, he again identified 3 subcircles: patriarchal cattle-rearing nomads, patrilineal totemic hire hunters, and matrilineal village-dwelling horticulturalists. Notice how detailed his classification system was, attempting to categorize every known society into a specific historical stratum. The secondary stage was divided into 2 main systems: a free patrilineal system found in places like Polynesia, India, and southern Europe, and a free matrilineal system found in southern China, Melanesia, and parts of South America. Finally, the tertiary grade represented the earliest higher civilizations of Asia, Europe, and the Americas. What is most striking about Schmidt's massive classification scheme is that despite being a diffusionist, his sequence of grades looks incredibly similar to the evolutionary sequences proposed by the classical evolutionists he criticized. Indeed, Schmidt's scheme was highly evolutionary. His progression from hunting and gathering to horticulture and finally to complex civilizations mirrored the very theories he opposed. His notion of the matrilineal horticultural circle was heavily indebted to early evolutionists like Bachofen and Morgan. Schmidt argued that during the hunter-gatherer stage, women specialized in collecting plants, which led them to invent horticulture. Because they worked the land, they became its owners, leading to matrilocal residence and matrilineal descent. This era was characterized by female deities and female property dominance, which later transitioned to male dominance in the patrilineal stages. Despite relying on evolutionary logic, Schmidt was a fierce critic of classical evolutionists like Tyler and Spencer. He and Grabner argued that culture is not a single entity constantly moving toward progress and increasing complexity. They pointed out that material culture often simplifies, and degeneration is a historical fact. For instance, they noted that European kinship systems are actually much simpler than those of Australian Aboriginals. They accused evolutionists of ethnocentrism, using European culture as the ultimate standard, and of misusing cultural survivals to reconstruct history. Yet, ironically, critics noted that Schmidt's own culture crisis school often fell into the same trap of using progress to explain cultural sequences. Beyond culture circles, Father Schmidt was deeply invested in establishing the origin of religion. He strongly disputed E.B. Tyler's theory that animism was the earliest form of religion. Using impressive ethnographic evidence, Schmidt argued that the most simple, primitive societies actually worshipped a single high god or allfather. He concluded that monotheism was the original form of human religion, and that the later addition of other gods and spirits was a sign of the degenerative tendency of man. He detailed this theory of primitive monotheism in his massive 12-volume work, The Origin of the Idea of God. However, commentators often accused him of mysticism, suggesting his conclusions were driven by his own religious commitments. Today, the culture crisis school is practically defunct. Its theories rested on monumental efforts but ultimately failed to prove themselves. The idea that all global culture emanated from just 4 or 5 early bands with separate migrations was pure speculation. Furthermore, their strict criteria of quality and quantity didn't work in reality because too many other influences interfere with cultural development. Just because 2 cultures share a trait doesn't prove historical contact. As critics noted, finding Coca-Cola in remote areas today doesn't mean those cultures share an ancient historical link. The greatest weakness of the German school was that it was purely descriptive. It mapped out what diffused, but completely failed to explain the dynamics of why diffusion and migration actually took place. This fundamental failure of the German school, describing the spread of culture traits without explaining the underlying causes of why diffusion takes place, paved the way for the next major development in anthropological thought. To answer the why and to address the shortcomings of both the British and German diffusionists, we must turn to the American School of Diffusion. Founded by Franz Boas and carried forward by scholars like Clark Whistler and A.L. Kroeber, this school would take a very different approach to understanding how cultures interact and grow. We will explore their contributions next. Moving forward with our discussion on diffusionism, let's examine the American School of Diffusion. Unlike the classical evolutionists who relied on universal sequences, the American diffusionists based their theories on empirical research. They observed that the give and take of culture traits happens primarily through transport and communication. Because culture is learned, groups living in close proximity naturally imitate and adapt each other's traits, making diffusion a continuous, ongoing process. A major dividing line between European and American diffusionists was the concept of degeneration. British and German scholars often stressed degeneration theory, suggesting that certain cultural groups progressed much further than others, while the rest degraded. The American school entirely rejected this. They argued that every culture makes its own unique adaptations to its environment. Therefore, comparing cultures to see which one progressed more is ultimately a futile exercise. The concept of mankind's psychic unity also caused a split. While evolutionists used psychic unity to explain why different cultures developed similar traits independently, British and German diffusionists rejected it entirely. Franz Boas and the American diffusionists took a nuanced stance. They embraced psychic unity as an ideology, primarily as a tool to combat racism, asserting the fundamental equality of human minds. However, they did not use it as a shortcut to explain away cultural similarities, which they believed were largely due to diffusion. So, how exactly does diffusion happen according to the American school? They identified 2 main ways. First, through the simple process of imitation, where traits spread from one group to another. Second, through borrowing and adaptation. It's often easier to borrow a useful trait than to invent it from scratch. Crucially, borrowing groups usually adapt these traits to fit their own needs, meaning the diffused traits might not exist in their original form. They also noted that geographical features like mountains, deserts, and a lack of transportation act as significant barriers to this process. To systematically study this diffusion, American anthropologists devised the culture area approach. Instead of trying to analyze diffusion globally all at once, they divided the world into distinct cultural areas based on geographical regions. The core premise is simple. If you travel through a region, you'll notice that groups living close to each other share much more cultural uniformity than groups living far apart. This concept, which reveals the geographical area of cultural similarities, was heavily emphasized by scholars like Clark Whistler, A.L. Kroeber, Melville Herskovits, and Edward Sapir. The methodology behind the culture area approach was heavily inspired by the museum practices of the German culture crisis school. During the 19th century, museums typically arranged items in evolutionary sequences, for example, placing all arrowheads from simplest to most complex, regardless of where they were found. Coinciding with Boas's critique of evolutionism, major American museums shifted to geographical categories. By arranging items based on where they came from, rather than an assumed evolutionary stage, visitors could gain a much better insight into specific Native American cultures as a whole. Let's look closer at the foundational figure of this school, Franz Boas. Born in Germany in 1858, Boas was a brilliant student who initially trained in the hard sciences. He studied physics, mathematics, and geography at the universities of Heidelberg, Bonn, and Kiel, eventually writing his doctoral dissertation on the color of seawater in 1881. His teachers applied theoretical concepts to anthropological research, and he was particularly inspired by the German evolutionist Adolf Rushton to undertake research on culture complexes. Boas's transition to anthropology began with an 1883 expedition to Baffinland in the Arctic as a geographer. He later visited the native tribes of the Pacific Northwest coast. His expertise led him to organize the anthropological collections for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. By 1896, he joined Columbia University, where he remained a professor until his death in 1942. Boas was a tireless organizer, central to founding major institutions like the American Anthropological Association and the American Folklore Society, effectively professionalizing the discipline in America. At Columbia, Boas firmly established anthropology's four-field approach, integrating linguistics, archaeology, physical anthropology, and ethnology. He trained a legendary generation of students, including Kroeber, Loewy, Sapir, Benedict, and Mead, who went on to establish anthropology departments across the United States. Interestingly, Boas instilled in his students a programmatic avoidance of grand theoretical synthesis. He demanded inductive purity, meaning theories must rise strictly from exhaustive field data, making his students highly skeptical of armchair theorizing. Over time, the central theme associated with Boas became known as historical particularism, closely tied to cultural relativism. This perspective required anthropologists to suspend grand theorizing and focus intensely on gathering specific, concrete historical facts about individual cultures. While critics argued this led to a sterile accumulation of data without theoretical progress, it was a necessary corrective at the time. Boas and his students were essentially building anthropology as a rigorous, university-based profession from the ground up, demanding high standards of proof. Boas's output was staggering. He touched on every aspect of the scientific study of humanity. Some of his most important books include Central Eskimo in 1888, Mind of Primitive Man in 1911, Primitive Art, and his 1940 compilation, Race, Language, and Culture. In addition to these major works, he contributed over 700 articles spanning ethnology, folklore, linguistics, and physical anthropology, leaving virtually no branch of the discipline untouched by his research. A major part of Boas's legacy is his devastating critique of the comparative method used by 19th century evolutionists. Evolutionists assumed that if two cultures had similar traits, they must be at the same stage of a universal evolutionary sequence. In his 1896 paper, The Limitation of Comparative Method, Boas argued this was fundamentally flawed. He pointed out that similar traits, like the use of masks or geometric designs, could easily arise from completely different historical causes or through diffusion. He insisted that you cannot assume a common cause. It must be empirically proven. To replace the flawed comparative method, Boas proposed the historical method. He emphasized that any cultural system is the unique product of its own specific historical processes. To find common origins for cultural similarities, anthropologists must look at small, well-defined geographical areas. If a trait is continuously distributed across an area, that's proof of a historical connection and diffusion. Because every culture's history is unique, Boas ultimately denied the existence of grand, general laws governing all human cultural development. In his 1911 book, The Mind of Primitive Man, Boas tackled the idea of environmental determinism. He explicitly showed that the natural environment does not dictate cultural forms. For example, he compared adjacent groups living in similar harsh environments, like the Eskimo and the Chukchi, or the Hottentot and the Bushmen, and showed they had vastly different cultures and social organizations. This proved the spontaneous creative influence of the human mind and further dismantled the evolutionist claim that cultures develop in parallel, predictable sequences. As an ethnographer, Boas felt a profound urgency to record Native American cultures, languages, and oral literatures before they disappeared under colonial pressure. He conducted intensive fieldwork, living with groups like the Kwakiutl and the Central Eskimo, producing full-length monographs on their social, linguistic, and ceremonial lives. He also pioneered the study of folklore in America, viewing oral traditions as the unwritten historical accounts of tribal societies. To preserve and analyze these myths and legends, he founded the American Folklore Society in 1888. Boas also made groundbreaking contributions to physical anthropology. Unlike his contemporaries who were obsessed with racial classification, Boas focused on human growth. He measured 19,000 children to show that individual growth is a continuous, dynamic process. Most famously, he studied the cephalic index, the shape of the head, of children born to immigrants in America. He proved that head shape, long thought to be a fixed racial trait, actually changed due to new environmental and nutritional conditions, dealing a massive blow to scientific racism. Despite his monumental influence, Boas's approach had its critics. Some noted that his very early work still clung to geographical determinism. Later scholars, like Leslie White, harshly criticized Boas for being so obsessed with collecting vast amounts of data that he failed to develop meaningful theories, and even questioned his fieldwork competence. Others argued his view of cultures as integrated wholes leaned too much into functionalism, ignoring historical depth. Nevertheless, his absolute insistence on objective, empirical data and mandatory fieldwork training permanently elevated the scientific standards of anthropology. This brings us to Clark Whistler, a prominent student of Franz Boas. Whistler was deeply influenced by Boas's natural history approach, but wanted to take the classification of cultures further. He was highly dissatisfied with earlier writers who treated all Native American populations as one uniform, undifferentiated group. Whistler believed it was crucial to locate the varieties of their modes of life and systematically classify these social groupings based on their dominant cultural traits and their specific geographical locations. Whistler formalized the culture area concept. He started with the simple observation that groups living close together have greater opportunities to borrow from each other, leading to greater cultural similarities. When you view these cultures objectively, they form clusters. The specific region where these similar cultures occur is called a culture area. Interestingly, this concept originated as a practical tool for museums to organize their massive ethnographic collections, building upon earlier environmental classifications proposed by Otis T. Mason in 1895. Whistler attempted to group native populations by specific traits, creating maps of food areas, textile areas, and ceramic areas. However, classifying whole cultures is incredibly complex. A major issue is that culture areas defined by material goods often do not match up with areas defined by non-material traits, like religion or social organization. Boas himself cautioned that myths and social structures diffuse differently than physical objects. Yet, despite these overlapping complexities, the culture area remained a vital tool for historical reconstruction. Applying this framework, Whistler mapped out comprehensive culture areas for the Americas. He identified 10 distinct areas for North America, such as the Plains, the Eskimo, and the Southwest, 4 for South America, including the Inca and Amazon, and 1 for the Caribbean. Seeking a common denominator for these groups, he looked at subsistence. He reduced his complex maps into 8 fundamental food areas, such as the bison area for the Plains Indians or the salmon area for the North Pacific coast, linking culture directly to environmental resources. To explain how these areas formed, Whistler posited the existence of a culture center for each area. This was theorized as the place of early settlement where various cultural traits originated and then diffused outward. According to this model, traits are most concentrated and typical at the center, and they diminish in number and intensity as you move toward the geographic margins, eventually blending into the next culture area. While this sounds a bit like British diffusionism on a smaller scale, Whistler crucially recognized that borrowed traits must be adapted to local conditions. Building on the culture center, Whistler formulated the law of diffusion, stating that traits tend to spread outward in all directions from their origin point. This led to his famous age-area principle. This principle was a method to guess the relative age of a cultural trait based on how far it had spread. The logic is that if traits diffuse outward at a relatively uniform rate, then the traits found furthest from the center, the most widely distributed ones, must be the oldest. It visualized diffusion as ripples spreading in concentric circles. Whistler also distinguished between two types of diffusion. Natural diffusion happens slowly, through trial and error and everyday contact between neighboring groups. It's an organic, indigenous process. Organized diffusion, on the other hand, is rapid and deliberate. It occurs through organized external agencies, such as the arrival of missionaries, military invaders, or sudden, intense contact with a completely alien culture. Whistler detailed these theories in influential books like The American Indian and Man and Culture. Now we turn to Alfred Lewis Kroeber, a towering figure who was actually Boas's very first doctoral student at Columbia. Unlike Boas, Kroeber came from a humanities background, studying literature. His 1901 dissertation on the decorative symbols of the Arapaho Indians showed that realistic and geometric art styles developed simultaneously, side by side. This directly challenged the evolutionist idea that art must progress in a strict unilinear sequence, from realistic to geometric. Kroeber went on to found the highly influential anthropology department at UC Berkeley. Early in his career, Kroeber launched a famous attack on the 19th century evolutionist Lewis Henry Morgan. Morgan had argued that kinship terminologies, how cultures name their relatives, reflected strict stages of sociological evolution. Kroeber argued in 1909 that kinship terms are primarily linguistic and psychological categories, not direct fossils of past social structures. Just because a culture uses a broad term like uncle doesn't prove they used to have a specific clan organization. He showed that different types of kinship terms can easily coexist in the same society.
Kroeber refined Whistler's ideas, replacing the static culture center with the dynamic concepts of cultural intensity and culture climax. Cultural intensity refers to the level of a culture's achievement and complexity, things like accurate calendars, religious hierarchies, and detailed property laws. The culture climax is the geographic area where this intensity is highest. It's the point where a culture is most highly organized, most productive, and best able to assimilate new ideas, acting as a powerful engine for diffusion to marginal areas.
In his quest to map these culture areas objectively, Kroeber and his students at Berkeley initiated the era of trait lists. They attempted to break cultures down into thousands of individual observable elements to run statistical correlations. Some lists grew to over 7,600 items. However, this mechanistic approach ultimately failed. Recording endless lists of items was exhausting, and worse, it provided absolutely no insight into how cultures actually functioned or why they changed. The dogmatic trait list approach was eventually abandoned as a barren exercise. Realizing that a culture is more than just a sum of its parts, Kroeber shifted his focus. He recognized that sensitive indicators like art, religion, and philosophy couldn't be captured by statistical trait lists. He moved toward a macroscopic study of history, culminating in his 1944 book, Configurations of Culture Growth. Here, he analyzed major world civilizations, noting that their growth peaks, their climaxes, coincided with periods where they successfully organized their ideas, styles, and standards into coherent, powerful configurations. Kroeber also formalized his theoretical stance in a 1915 article detailing 18 professions of anthropology, which summarized his version of historical particularism. He argued that the aim of history is to understand how social facts relate to the whole civilization. Crucially, he stated that civilization is an entity unto itself, distinct from biological life. He firmly rejected environmental determinism, stating geography is merely material used by civilization, not the cause of it. He also demanded the assumption of absolute equality among all human races. Perhaps Kroeber's most famous theoretical contribution is the concept of culture as superorganic. He argued that culture exists in a separate realm of phenomena, above biology and psychology, and can only be explained by its own cultural laws. While individuals carry and transmit culture, culture itself is super-individual. It is not the creation of any one person, and its continuity does not depend on any single individual. A culture's habits and traditions persist generation after generation, long after individual members pass away. To prove this superorganic force, Kroeber pointed to the principle of simultaneity. He compiled lists of major scientific discoveries, like the telescope, oxygen, or the telephone, that were invented simultaneously by different people working completely independently. For Kroeber, this proved that inventions aren't just the result of isolated individual genius. They happen because the superorganic culture has reached a point where that invention is inevitable. He used language as another example. You learn English, but you don't invent its grammar. It exists above and beyond you. Not everyone agreed with this extreme view. Edward Sapir, a brilliant anthropological linguist, strongly criticized Kroeber's superorganic concept. Sapir argued that you simply cannot ignore the significance of the individual in cultural processes. He pointed out that Kroeber's evidence relied entirely on technological inventions, which naturally build upon previous discoveries. Sapir challenged Kroeber to apply his superorganic theory to art, religion, or philosophy, areas where individual creativity and human emotion are undeniably central. Returning to the culture area scheme, it faced significant criticism over time. First, critics noted it's merely a classification tool, a construct of the anthropologist, not a reality recognized by the people actually living there. Second, the concepts of centers and margins lack real ethnographic validity. Human migration makes it nearly impossible to draw firm boundaries or trace exact origins. Third, the geographic approach completely fails when applied to complex industrialized societies, where social class and occupation create cultural differences that totally override geography. The criticisms continued. The scope of the culture area approach was deemed too narrow, focusing on regional mapping while failing to explain long-distance worldwide diffusion. It also relied far too heavily on material objects, like baskets and arrows, while struggling to map non-material culture, like beliefs and social structures. Furthermore, it created an unfair hierarchy, implying that people living in the culture's center were brilliant innovators, while those in the marginal areas were nothing more than passive borrowers. Finally, the methodology itself was flawed. Whistler's core assumption that traits diffuse uniformly in all directions like ripples in a pond was proven empirically false. Traits spread on specific routes at very different rates. And as we discussed, the trait listing method became a confusing, exhausting mess with no standard agreement among researchers. However, it's important to note that these scholars weren't dogmatic. They recognized these shortcomings and constantly tried to refine their models, such as Kroeber replacing the static center with the dynamic cultural climax. Let's briefly compare the major schools of diffusion. The British and German schools shared an anti-evolutionary stance, rejecting universal stages and psychic unity. However, they differed sharply. The British were extreme, arguing that all culture originated in one single place, Egypt. The Germans were more moderate, arguing for multiple centers of origin around the world. Methodologically, the Germans were much more rigorous, using strict criteria of form and quantity to trace complex culture circles, whereas the British relied on a much simpler, less rigorous model of diffusion. Comparing the British and American schools reveals even starker contrasts. While the British insisted everything came from Egypt, the Americans firmly believed in multiple independent centers of invention based on local needs. The British attempted to write a single cultural history for the entire world, whereas the Americans meticulously divided the world into specific, manageable culture areas. Finally, the British were degenerationists, believing most cultures had fallen from a higher state, while the Americans viewed every culture as successfully adapting and progressing in its own unique environment. The culture area concept wasn't just used in the Americas. It was also applied as a tool for historical reconstruction in India, providing an alternative to evolutionary speculation. Scholars attempted to classify tribal India based on geographical similarities. Early classifications divided the country into broad northeastern, central, and southwestern zones. Later anthropologists, like Roy Berman in 1972 and Vidyarthi and Rai in 1976, refined this, proposing much more detailed territorial groups and subregions to better capture the ethnic and sociocultural realities of the subcontinent. To see how detailed this mapping can get, look at the state of Bihar, which anthropologists divided into 4 distinct cultural linguistic zones based on spoken languages. These are the Magahi, Bhojpuri, Maithili, and tribal cultural zones, each encompassing specific districts. While there are always minor variations in language at the borders where people interact, these 4 zones provide a clear, broad framework for understanding the regional cultural variations within a single state. In the Indian context, ancient shrines and the confluences of holy rivers have acted as powerful culture centers since time immemorial. Places like Gaya, famous for ancestral worship, or Rajgir and Prayagraj, draw millions of devotees. When pilgrims travel to these centers for massive religious fairs, they don't just worship, they interact, share, and bring new cultural traits back to their home regions. This highlights how religious fairs and pilgrimages act as powerful mechanisms for cultural diffusion across regions. We'll continue exploring these dynamics in the next section. Picking up right where we left off with the British and American schools of diffusion, we see a stark contrast in how they categorized the diffusion process itself. The British diffusionists didn't bother creating a typology for how diffusion occurred. In contrast, American anthropologist Clark Whistler specifically classified diffusion into two categories: natural diffusion and organized diffusion. Furthermore, the British school largely ignored concepts of cultural intensity and climax. The American school, however, actively discussed them. A.L. Kroeber actually introduced the concepts of cultural climax and intensity specifically to fix a flaw in Whistler's work. Whistler's culture area concept was too static, so Kroeber added these new ideas to better explain cultural dynamism and how cultures change over time. Now, let us shift our focus to the comparison between the German and American schools of diffusion. Interestingly, despite their later disagreements, they shared several foundational views. Both were strictly anti-evolutionist, meaning they rejected the idea that all cultures go through a universal sequence of evolutionary stages. They also completely rejected the concept of psychic unity as an explanation for cultural similarities. Instead of believing that different peoples independently invented the same things because human minds work similarly, they argued that important inventions only happened once. These inventions then spread either through imitation, which is pure diffusion, or through the physical migration of culture carriers. Finally, both schools shared a museum methodology. By physically organizing museum artifacts based on geography, they could visually demonstrate that cultures located closer together shared more items, which they argued was clear evidence of diffusion. Despite those shared foundations, the German and American schools diverged sharply on several theoretical points. The first major difference was their stance on degeneration theory. The German diffusionists supported this theory, which inherently suggested that some cultures progressed more than others, while others degenerated. The American diffusionists strongly opposed this. They argued that every culture simply adapts to its environment in its own unique way, making it completely futile to judge whether one culture progressed more than another. Additionally, while the German school heavily emphasized the physical migration of people as the main vehicle for spreading culture, the American school focused more on the abstract process of diffusion, radiating outward from specific culture centers. Another fascinating distinction lies in how they handled the concept of psychic unity. As we established, neither school believed psychic unity caused parallel inventions. However, the German diffusionists essentially discarded the concept altogether. They didn't use it as an explanatory principle for anything. The American diffusionists, on the other hand, found a very important use for it. They utilized the concept of psychic unity, the idea that all human beings share the same fundamental cognitive capacities, as a direct tool to combat racism. By emphasizing that all races share this underlying psychological unity, they argued against the biological determinism and racial hierarchies that were prevalent at the time. The core analytical frameworks of the two schools also differed significantly. The German school utilized the concept of Kulturkreise, or cultural circles. These circles were meant to indicate different layers or stages of cultural development. More importantly, the German school used these circles as a dynamic device to track how cultural traits migrated and accumulated continuously over different phases of time. The American school, conversely, relied on culture areas. This concept was primarily concerned with mapping the geographical distribution of culture complexes. Because it was so focused on geography, the American culture area model was inherently static. It was very good at showing where traits were located, but it struggled to explain the historical changes that had occurred over time, even though they tried to study the stratification of these elements to guess at their history. Further differences emerged in their views on evolution, methodology, and typology. Even though both were broadly anti-evolutionist, the German school's major phases of culture circles still retained a degree of evolutionary significance. The American culture areas did not attempt to explain evolutionary significance at all, though they didn't entirely deny that independent inventions could happen. Methodologically, to explain similarities and differences, the German school developed complex criteria of form and criteria of quantity. The Americans preferred a more straightforward trait listing approach to track diffusion. Finally, when it came to typologies, Fritz Graebner of the German school divided diffusion into primary and secondary types. whereas Clark Whistler of the American School, as we noted earlier, classified it into natural and organized diffusion. Now, let's apply these theoretical concepts of cultural diffusion to a real-world historical context, the Indian subcontinent. The cultural history of India provides a perfect case study. Originally, indigenous tribal populations inhabited Bharatvarsha and were the makers of the advanced Indus Valley civilization. However, a massive cultural shift occurred with the Aryan invasion. The Aryans had a distinct technological advantage. They possessed horses and iron-made weapons. This allowed them to emerge victorious, driving the indigenous populations back into hilly and forested areas. Following this displacement, Aryan culture established itself in the northwest regions of India, setting the stage for a massive, gradual process of cultural diffusion across the rest of the subcontinent. As the Aryans progressed eastward from the Punjab, their initial instinct was to destroy everything non-Aryan. However, over time, this hostility transformed into a profound cultural amalgamation. A policy of mutual give and take took root. Aryan sages played a significant role in this by establishing marriages with indigenous populations, leading to a deep fusion of beliefs. We can see clear evidence of pre-Vedic, non-Aryan cultural traits diffusing into Vedic Aryan religion. For example, the worship of Mahadeva or the Shiva Lingam, serpent worship, and tree worship were all originally pre-Vedic practices that the Aryans eventually adopted. Similarly, Chaitya worship, involving constructed places of worship associated with funeral remains, and the reverence for semi-divine beings known as yakshas were integrated into the Aryan belief system. This gradual synthesis of Vedic and non-Aryan religions completely reshaped the cultural landscape, a process we will continue to explore as we look at the evolution of the Brahmin leadership. Let's look at how pre-Vedic and Vedic faiths diffused among indigenous populations. Over time, tribal communities living alongside non-tribal Hindus began to adopt many beliefs and practices of the Hindu religion. They started celebrating major festivals like Holi, Dashera, Deepawali, and Ram Navami. Furthermore, they began worshipping various Hindu gods and goddesses, even visiting Hindu shrines to offer worship and participate in religious fairs. This shows a clear cultural accommodation within the Aryan pantheon. Moving on to the diffusion of sun worship. While sun worship was prevalent among the inhabitants of the Indus Valley, they did not have an anthropomorphic or human-like representation of the sun god. Instead, seals and pottery depicted a circular disc or wheel representing the sun's orbit. In contrast, ancient Egypt depicted the sun god in human form as a ruler commanding the universe. Historians suggest that the process of giving the sun god human traits in India was likely a diffused concept borrowed from these older civilizations like Egypt. So, when do we see the first human-like sun god in India? The earliest image was discovered on a piece of pottery from Patna, dating back to the Mauryan period. It depicts the sun god standing with his charioteer, Aruna, on a chariot drawn by 4 horses, holding a conical-edged arrow. Antiquarians point out that this human representation was likely borrowed from the Greeks. Remember, Chandragupta Maurya defeated the Greek king Seleucus and married his daughter, opening cultural exchange. The great Indologist Cunningham even noted that the 4 horses and general execution strongly resemble Helios, the Greek sun god. Clear architectural evidence of sun worship emerges during the Saka Kusana period. The very first temple dedicated to the sun god was erected at Multan, which is modern-day Multan in Pakistan. It was built by the Sakas or Magas of Iran. Interestingly, the deity's image resembled a Kusana king, complete with a cap and boots. As these Maga Brahmanas migrated across India, they built numerous sunshines between the 4th and 12th centuries AD. By the time of the Gupta age, these initially Greek and Iranian-styled images were completely Indianized, adapted to fit seamlessly into Vedic and Puranic traditions. Now, let's examine the diffusion of Buddhism. Originating in the 6th century BC in the Magadha region, roughly today's Gaya and Patna districts in Bihar, Buddhism developed as a direct reaction against old Brahmanism. The existing system was full of inequality, and large numbers of animals were sacrificed in the name of yagya. Lord Buddha heavily criticized these practices. The people of Magadha, who were often treated as kikata or vratya, meaning impure, by the Brahmanas, found solace in this new religious revolution and gladly became followers of Buddha. Buddhism offered a refreshing change because its ideas were fundamentally democratic. Unlike the rigid caste system, any person above the Varna restrictions was allowed to become a member. Buddhist associations became vibrant centers of kindness, sacrifice, humanity, virtue, and nonviolence. Lord Buddha established an association of Buddhist monks, and these monks played a highly significant role. They traveled extensively, spreading the ideologies of Buddhism not just to the masses within the country, but eventually to other parts of the world. The rapid diffusion of Buddhism was heavily supported by royal patronage. Contemporary kings of Buddha's time, like Bimbisar, Ajatasattu, Prasenjit, and Udayan, were true followers. A couple of centuries later, the great Mauryan king Ashoka took massive initiatives to make Buddhism a Vishvadharma, or a world religion. He even sent his own son Mahenka, daughter-in-law Kanchan, and daughter Sanghamitra to Sri Lanka as religious messengers. Thanks to Ashoka and later kings like Kanishka, Harshavardhana, and the Pala dynasty, Buddhism spread far and wide to Myanmar, Tibet, China, Japan, and Thailand. To sustain and spread this knowledge, numerous Buddhist institutions were established. Famous universities like Nalanda, Takshila, and Vikramshila attracted students from foreign countries, though sadly these were destroyed in medieval times. The diffusion of Buddhism was also formalized through 4 great meetings or councils. The first, at Rajgir, edited Buddhist preachings into the Tripitayak. The second, at Vaishali, modified these texts. The third, organized by Ashoka at Patliputra, finalized the Buddhist literature. Finally, the fourth meeting during Kanishka's reign saw the writing of detailed annotations and ancient Buddhist books. Shifting our focus to regional religious practices, let's look at the diffusion of Chat Vrata. This is a highly important festival for Hindus, primarily in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and is deeply associated with sun worship. It takes place twice a year, on the 6th bright day of the Chait and Kartik months. The entire Vrata, or fasting period, lasts for 4 days. The central ritual involves offering arghya to the sun god while standing in a river or pond, performed in the evening of the 6th day and the morning of the 7th day. But why is this festival so concentrated in Bihar and eastern UP? According to mythological stories, the practice originated at an ancient place called Deokunda in the Aurangabad district of Bihar, at the hermitage of Rishi Chaivana. The legend says that Shukanya, the wife of Chaivana, performed this vrata twice to restore the eyesight and health of her blind, aging husband. She did this on the advice of the Ashwini Kumars, the physicians to the gods. When her desires were fulfilled, Deokunda became known as the originator of Chat Vrata, and from there the cultural traits diffused outward. The way these various practices blend brings us to the concept of the different layers of religion in India. The German school of diffusion, known as Kulturkreise or culture circle, argues that culture doesn't just originate in one place, like Egypt. Instead, it originates in many places and diffuses outward. As these cultural traits migrate, they accumulate in a particular culture, creating distinct historical layers. If we examine India's religious life, it clearly reveals these different layers, arising from different periods, with tribal religion being the absolute earliest, existing since prehistoric times. Let's transition to the cultural centers of art and architecture, starting with the Saka Kushana period from 2 BC to 280. 2 major schools of art emerged. The Gandhara school, located in modern-day Afghanistan, was heavily under the influence of Greek art and architecture. In contrast, the Mathura school was distinctly Indianized. It produced a vast number of images of Lord Buddha, Hindu deities, and nature motifs. The reigns of Kushana kings like Kanishka, Huvishka, and Dasudeva marked a golden age for the Mathura school, firmly introducing Indian traditions into image-making. Following the Kushanas, the Gupta period represents the absolute climax of Indian image-making and architecture. During this time, numerous shrines were erected, and images were meticulously sculptured according to established Vedic and Puranic traditions, moving away from foreign influences. Several locations became vital cultural centers of art and architecture, including Mathura in UP, Bharhut and Sachi in Madhya Pradesh, and Patliputra, Nalanda, and Bodh Gaya in Bihar. As we move into the medieval period, distinct regional schools of architecture flourished in North India. The Orisan school, active from the 8th to 13th centuries, gave us magnificent monuments like the Lingaraja temple in Bhubaneswar, the Jagannath temple at Puri, and the famous Black Pagoda at Konarka. In Bundelkhand, the Kandela kings built the beautiful temples at Khajuraho. Meanwhile, in Rajasthan and Gujarat, the Kandakya and Solanki kings utilized immense wealth from trade with Arabs and Persians to build stunning Jaina and Hindu temples, such as the lovely Jaina shrines of Mount Abu. When considering the vast size of India, temple architecture is remarkably uniform, but authorities distinguish between 2 primary styles. The northern, or Indo-Aryan style, prefers a tower with a rounded top and a curvilinear outline. Conversely, the southern, or Dravidian style, is typically shaped like a rectangular, truncated pyramid. It's worth noting that the evolutionary stages of these styles are much clearer in South India, primarily because many ancient temples in northern India were unfortunately destroyed by Muslim invaders. In South India, temple building gained immense momentum under the patronage of the Pallava and Chalukya kings between the 6th and 8th centuries. The Pallavas left their mark at Mamallapuram and Kanchi, while the Chalukyas built at Badami and Aihols. These styles show a gradual emancipation from older techniques of carpentry and cave architecture. The absolute peak of the Pallava style is seen in the Shore Temple at Mamallapuram and the Kalistanas Temple of Kanchi, built in the 8th century. They feature pyramidal towers and barrel vaults that subtly suggest the shape of a Buddhist stupa. The Dravidian style continued to evolve beautifully. Under the Chola dynasty from the 10th to 12th centuries, we see masterpieces like the Temple of Shiva at Tanjore, built by Rajaraja the Great. In the next phase, known as the Pandyan style, named after the dynasty that supplanted the Cholas, a major architectural shift occurred. The emphasis moved away from the tower above the main shrine, and instead, architects focused on grand entrance gateways in the surrounding walls. The culmination of this Pandyan style can be seen in the mighty, sprawling temple complexes of Madurai and Srirangam. While the Pandyan style dominated the Tamil country, another distinct style developed in the Deccan region under the Chalukya, Rashtrakutas, and Hoysalas. Emerging between the 11th and 14th centuries, the Hoysala architecture moved away from rectangular plans. Instead, temples were polygonal and raised on tall, solid platforms. Finally, the great school that flourished under the Vijayanagara Empire, reaching its apogee in the 16th century, masterfully combined these traditions, showcasing a brilliant synthesis of both Pandyan and Hoysala features. To wrap up our discussion, the overarching theme here is the profound impact of cultural diffusion across India. Whether it's the assimilation of tribal faiths, the spread of sun worship and Buddhism, or regional festivals like Chhat Vrata, these practices diffused through royal patronage, migration, and cultural blending. Indian religion and art are not static. They are accumulated layers of history, from prehistoric tribal roots to Greek and Iranian influences. Similarly, the diverse architectural marvels, from the Mathura school to the grand Dravidian temples, perfectly illustrate how cultural traits continuously traveled, adapted, and flourished across the subcontinent.